Hello and welcome everyone in the room and on Zoom tonight. I'm Mark Pinto, Adult Services Director here at Phoenixville Public Library. And if I calculate right, this month marks the 246th anniversary of the beginning of the Continental Army encampment at Valley Forge. Hey,
yeah,
got my math right. Okay. And our program tonight deals with prisoners of war who were at Valley Forge during the Revolution and elsewhere too during that time. And we are very pleased to have with us tonight, direct from Valley Forge National Historical Park, Russell Brindley, who is a park guide and who came to us courtesy of his passport application appointment a couple of months ago in the library. Pleased to meet you then, Russell, and thanks for coming tonight. All right. Take it away. Oh, folks, please hold your questions until the end. Those on Zoom, and at that time you'll be able to unmute or type in the chat. All right. Take it away.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you and for the Phoenixville Library for having me here, and thank all of you braving the crazy weather we've had for the last 2 days. And every time I do this type of program, I'm always competing with the weather and a Phillies sports program. There is one at 8 o'clock tonight, so go Birds. And last year I had to compete with the Phillies in the World Series. But anyway, so thank you again for being here. And so as Mark said, I'm one of the park guides. My name is Russell Brindley at Valley Forge National Historical Park, and I've been at Valley Forge now since 2018, and even a little earlier than that as a seasonal employee. So the title of tonight's program is Prisoners of War During the American Revolution. So when we think of prisoners of war, a lot of people might think about prisons themselves, the structure, maybe torture, maybe a former U.S. Senator John McCain and his experience in the Vietnam War or the Vietnam War collectively, or maybe some of you might think of Andersonville, a Civil War prison down in Georgia. Maybe you might be familiar with, maybe there were some ships in New York City during the American Revolution that might have had some of Americans, but that might be it. And so hopefully what you'll get from today is that it's nuanced and it's all over the place for the prisoner of war experience during our American Revolution. So this is going to be about a 40 to 45 minute program of me yapping here and about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. And I'm going to break down this program into 4 parts, but before I get to that, I want everyone to look at this quote here. Relieve us of this burden. Lieutenant Colonel Nesbord Belford, he's the commander of Charleston. He's the British commander of Charleston in 1780, and he writes to his superiors in England, relieve us of this burden. So I want you to kind of think about, relieve us of this burden. Something related to prisoners of war. So there's going to be a theme you're going to see throughout this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to break down this program into 4 different parts here for you. I'm going to talk about the creation of the system of prisoners of war. I'm going to talk about the British prisoner of war experience, the American prisoner of war experience, and then finally the legacy and memory of prisoners of war in the American Revolution. I'm going to ask you a question here for my audience. What types of needs do you think you'll need to provide to a prisoner of war? What do we think?
Food.
Food is a big one. You gotta eat. Yeah. That's what I did before I came here. I would have been very hungry. So you got food. What else would someone need? Clothing. Good. What about a structure? Yes, like where we are right now, a place for all of them to stay. So think about those things and that burden aspect throughout this. So, what is a prisoner of war? Well, a prisoner of war is any soldier who is captured in battle. That's pretty simple. And these are some examples, some iconography of prisoners of war during the American Revolution. You might be familiar with some of them. You might not be at all. Maybe you're familiar with this image right here. At the bottom right. This is the surrender of the British Army at Yorktown in 1781. About 6,000 soldiers surrender to, not George Washington, to Benjamin Lincoln. second in command of the Continental Army at that time period. George Washington's over here, but he's the one who negotiates that surrender. You might think of this guy, Ethan Allen, not the furnishing company, Revolutionary War general, who will eventually help found Vermont. You might think of this guy. That's Charles Lee. Not related to Robert E. Lee, that's a different Lee family. Charles Lee was second in command of the Continental Army during the beginning of the American Revolution, and he will be captured, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later on. Or you might have seen this image, the American snake surrounding two British armies of Saratoga and Yorktown. So thousands of soldiers on both sides during the American Revolution are going to be prisoners of war. Some for months, some for days, some for possibly years. It's common for these prisoners to be exchanged in complex bargaining arrangements called cartels. Under these cartels, each man had a value. Usually these exchanges involved men of similar rank. So private for a private, a general for a general, a major for a major, a sergeant for a sergeant, etc., etc. But they might not do that all the time. What they might do is they might create these things called compositions or packages, where they might figure out, and they will do this during the American Revolution and before in the French and Indian War, how many privates equal a major general. So there you go. So it's going to take about 372 of us to eventually equal to a George Washington or a Charles Lee or Horatio Gates or a Benedict Arnold, any of those folks. Brigadier General, 200. Your Colonel, 100. If there's any captains, former captains in the Army, you might be 16. Sergeants are 6, so they have some value. They're important. Your other sergeants too, and then again, bottom of the barrel, 1 for 1, privates for privates. These captives are expected to be cared and supplied by their own governments. So we're talking about the pay, we're talking about the clothing that you mentioned, ma'am, before, not by the captors. So again, if the British, I'm going to go back real quick, are captured by the Americans, the British government is supposed to provide clothing and their pay to those British soldiers. While the Americans, we're supposed to find housing and give these guys food, vice versa. Over time, officers, so the upper echelons, if you will, of colonial America or British society, again, all of these people who are worth a little bit more, they could give their word of honor as a gentleman to stay out of the fighting during the American Revolution, not attempt to flee or escape, and live quietly as a gentleman in wherever they are. That could be New York City, that could be Philadelphia, that could be in England, wherever they are going to be sent, until they are exchanged for someone of equal value or a whole bunch of privates, etc., etc. The soldiers, everybody else, they can't be trusted. No, 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 no. They have to be confined, controlled, regulated, watched during the Revolutionary War, because they make up most of the army. They're the ones who do most of the fighting. In addition to that, these officers are going to have considerable freedom to move around and socialize under their conditions. So think of it almost as like a house arrest, but they're able to explore a little bit here and there, come back before sunset, or they're going to be in trouble. For example, you might be familiar with John Andre. John Andre is a British officer. He'll eventually be executed for spying and working with Benedict Arnold, but he was captured in 1776 during the invasion of Canada. He's sent to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, not too far from here, and he writes, "It was a fine country. We passed our time making music and reading books." That sounds wonderful. You'll see later on, he was actually sent to Carlisle before Lancaster, and he had a little bit of a different view of Carlisle. So I hope nobody's from Carlisle here. But you'll see that. So, but overall, these officers, they're having a good time. In 1776, congressional resolution on these exchanges made things vague. All right, now we're getting a little what? Now we're getting complicated here. It specified that these exchanges, again, should be based on rank to rank, but it gave the commanders of each department. So Washington's in charge of the whole Continental Army. but he's got people underneath him, second in command, third in command, but they're going to set up these different military departments. Think of theaters of war. So you're going to have a department in New England. You have a department in the Mid-Atlantic where we are. You're going to have a department in the South, Virginia down to Georgia. Those commanding officers have the power to negotiate for people who are captured. It's not just George Washington. It's these individual commanders down where there might be a threat down there. In addition to that, so you got George Washington, you got these military commanders, you can have the states. Remember, there's 13 states, not 50 yet. They have the right to make any exchanges they think are proper for any prisoners taken for them or by them. So it's unclear of who has authority. Who's really in charge? Is it the states? Is it these commanders? Is it George Washington in charge of the whole army? We don't know. And who else doesn't know, who really needs to know, is the British. The British have no idea who they should be negotiating with. Should it be the states? Should it be the local militia leaders? They don't know. And those people are going to change throughout the Revolutionary War. People are going to be replaced, people are going to be fired, people are going to be killed, etc., etc. In addition, because of all of that, it's going to take months for these guys to be set free. Because again, the British don't know who they need to negotiate with and where these people are. Because remember, armies are on the move. They are not static in certain places like military barracks, like we have at West Point, or some of these other barracks around the United States today. They're moving around. So the British are like, well, you're not here. Where are you? Who do we need to talk to? Where do we need to go? So that's going to be a problem. Washington's dealing with the British commander at the time period, his name is William Howe, is hampered by irregular record keeping. He had no ideas which Americans were in the enemy hands and which of the enemies were in American hands. And so he had to work with the state governments, and the state governments are holding on to, well, we have a couple British soldiers, we have a couple British officers, and we want to negotiate. And George Washington's like, no, I need those people as a bargaining chip to get some of my soldiers back. And the states don't want to do it. They are not working with George Washington, so he is dealing with a lot of problems, not just during the Valley Forge time period, throughout the Revolutionary War, related to prisoners of war. Congress wanted the British to also stop arresting non-combatants. So we're talking about civilians like all of us today. Or at least exchange them for privates, for officers, for generals on a one-to-one basis. Again, they had no idea how many of these people were taken, where were they taken, and why they were taken. So we're talking about the farmers. So imagine during the encampment here at Valley Forge, that way, the British are in Philadelphia, spoiler alert, 20 miles away, and you have a no man's land. Okay, there's no King of Prussia Mall, no suburbia, I'm sorry, it's all farmland. And there's a couple thousand people living out there. The British are going out there, they might arrest people, and they send them to Philadelphia. Washington has no idea where they are, and he can't get them back. So that's a big problem. Each state also appointed a commissary of prisoners to negotiate the release of some of those civilians or some of those soldiers. So again, you got George Washington, you got the military departments, you might have local militia leaders, you can have the state governments, you can also have commissary prisoner officials as well. So you have all these people not talking to each other, not working together. It's going to be a problem, right? Yeah. So, both sides were in this position where they could not afford to retreat. For the Americans, for the instance of written agreements, we want written documentation of how many people you have, where are they located, how can we get them back. That's what they want, because we don't have a sense of where they are. If we have this documentation, great, that can help us. The British government's like, no written agreements, because if we write this stuff down, it's going to be considered a de facto recognition of the United States. And the British government does not want that to happen. If they allow that to happen, France is going to get involved, Spain is going to get involved, the Netherlands are going to get involved, other European powers are like, oh, you're fighting another country. And maybe we want to be in on that. Instead of an internal rebellion, revolt, uprising, whatever you want to call it, that's what the British government wants. So they don't want any of this stuff written down. Each side is supposed to provide those soldiers and officers with their pay and their allowance so they can go buy extra food or blankets or clothes, things that they might need. And again, this is going to be done through some other agents as well. So Washington's going to have some agents, and this is the most well-known. His name is Elias Boutno. He is from New Jersey, Elizabeth, New Jersey. And he works tirelessly for a couple years trying to negotiate with the British to free thousands of soldiers captured during the American Revolution. He will spend a lot of his own money because he's not getting enough from Congress, from George Washington, to do the job that needs to be done. The British are going to have their own version. Besides those military commanders, this is him right here. He's a Commodore, so he's in the British Army. He was from New England. He is a loyalist, or Tory, or traitor, or patriot. Depends on which side of the war we're talking about. And his name is Joshua Loring. And he will have a brief stint in Philadelphia during the British occupation of Philadelphia. And so he is trying to free any British soldiers or German soldiers that Washington has, or all those other people have. So you got all these people here. The British are supposed to provide that allowance of food. However, it's so little, it's often bad quality, I should say, if not contaminated, and there's no means of supplementing it. So the food that the British government is supposed to provide to George Washington's soldiers that are captured, it's nothing. Food vendors, so think of people out in a little market, or you're at the mall and somebody comes up to you trying to sell you stuff, that's what we're talking about. They're going to these buildings, these places, wherever they are, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and they're trying to sell extra food and possibly clothing or medical supplies to those soldiers who are in prison ships or jails, if they have food. If they have money. And a lot of times they won't have money to buy that extra food because the British government are not giving it to them. So, with all that being said, I know I threw a lot at you right there. How do we think, with the British government not providing enough food, enough clothing initially to these Americans, how do you think they're going to be treated by Washington? You think the same? Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, you're treating us like dirt. We're going to treat your guys like dirt. That'll show you. All right. Anybody else? Different opinions? Yes, ma'am.
He had people that went out and to farms and things like that and tried to get food for the army.
Okay, so he's going to try to work with some other people to get that food for the army and all of that. All right. Very good. Okay. So what's going to happen is they're going to set up numerous prisoner of war camps. So we're getting close to that Valley Forge connection for you. Don't worry, Mark. And they're going to be established throughout the East Coast, and there will be some in southern England. And again, this is a map that I put together. I apologize, Boston is a little bit higher than it should be, but it's okay. So a lot of these prisoner of war camps are going to be located in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. It's going to held over 10,000 British and German forces captured by the Americans during the American Revolution. About 5,400 are going to be Germans or Hessians, soldiers, captured during the American Revolution. A lot of these soldiers who lost battle had this fear and this anxiety that they are not good heroes. They lost the battle. They did not die in combat. They surrendered to the enemy. And so they fear that their own government in England or in America, vice versa, is going to turn their backs on them and say, you didn't do your job. You lost. And you surrendered. We don't care about you. And so there's this anxiety of all these people going to these places that they're not going to come out of. Show you another map here a little better that I found actually in a book a while ago. And again, Boston is going to be one briefly, East Windsor, Hartfield, Easton, Bethlehem, Reading, not too far from here, Lebanon, Lancaster that I mentioned, York, Carlisle, Philadelphia. Then we got down in Frederick, Maryland, Winchester, Dumfries, Charlottesville, and as Mark said in the beginning there, even Valley Forge. Valley Forge will be a prisoner of war camp for the British Army. December 16th and 17th of 1778. So the following year. So tomorrow we're going to celebrate the Army marching in the Valley Forge. The following year, British Army marches in the Valley Forge. What's going to happen with these places is they're going to construct barracks, and I'm going to show you a little bit of what they look like later on. They're going to be constructed by the prisoners themselves, not by the guards. That's not their job. It's the prisoners. You have to build the shelter. These camps are going to be hopefully self-sufficient with land and supplies to grow their own food if they can't get it. Some cases they'll do that, some not so much. These prisoners might be even paroled, as you were kind of talking about, ma'am, to work on some of these American farms. You're going to be allowed to go out and explore the countryside and maybe do a little physical labor to get that extra pay and get that food if you can't get it from Washington's army. There'll be a pass system that will allow some of these prisoners to work with the residents to supplement their camp's meager rations. Wives and children will accompany many of these soldiers. It's a common practice of the time period. They are called camp followers. Women and children will follow armies from antiquity up until the time of the American Civil War. So think about that on both sides. Washington ordered his troops to take these prisoners and treat them with humanity. So he wanted to treat them with respect. So, we'll talk a little bit about the experience of these guys. That is Trumbull pinning in the early 1800s of the surrender of the British Army at the Battle of Saratoga. Happened in October of 1777 while Washington's main army is fighting around the Philadelphia area, and we're getting our butt kicked and we're losing, and we eventually lose Philadelphia. That gentleman right there, a bunch of other generals, is Horatio Gates. So you got Daniel Morgan there. I don't see a young Benedict Arnold. That might be him right there. I'm not sure. They successfully captured 6,000 British soldiers in that battle. The largest surrender up until that time period for the British Army. They are shocked that they surrendered to a rabble, a rebellion. So, this painting depicts not the surrender, it's called the convention, rather than a capitulation. During the negotiation between John Burgoyne, the British commander, and Horatio Gates, the American commander, he decides, well, we're not going to feed and clothe, and we're not going to put 6,000 British soldiers in Lancaster or York. We just can't do that. It's not a good idea. We'll send them back to England on the promise that these guys will pick up the guns, come back over here, and fight us. That's the idea. So they're going to be paroled, and go to Boston, and get on those ships. Congress says that is a horrible idea. We're never going to let them go to Europe, because what the British government's going to do is going to take that 6,000 soldiers, they'll send them to Gibraltar, they'll send them to Majorca, they'll send them down to Jamaica to take over those British provinces and bases. And the garrisons that are there, they'll send those guys to fight us here in and around Philadelphia. So the British will lose no soldiers. It will be not a net gain. It won't be a net loss for the British Army. So they're not going to do that. So they're going to delay and delay and delay. The British Army's waiting to get on those boats in Boston. They're waiting and waiting and waiting, figuring out what's going on. And eventually they decide, you're not sticking around Boston, because the local community is very scared of 6,000 soldiers and women and children for the British and the Germans hanging out outside. They already dealt with the British there before. They don't want them there again. So they're going to go on a little adventure. It's called the Convention Army. Close to 6,000 officers and about 600 women and children. And they're outside of Boston near Winter Hill, Prospect Hill. And they're going to make their way from community to community through northern Connecticut, through my home state of New Jersey, eventually through Pennsylvania, on their way down to Charlottesville. And they're going to stop, like I said, a night or two at Valley Forge. So, the Army arrives December 17th, 1778, the British Army of a couple thousand. It's about 5,000. Couple hundred here and there will die of diseases or disappear because there's not enough guards for 6,000 people. And so an officer, again, remember that rank has privileges. So Thomas Embury, he's a British officer. He writes, and I'm only going to read some of it here, and you can kind of see the rest of it there. Our troops slept in the huts at Valley Forge, so the same huts that the Americans built, that were constructed by the Americans. And we waited till late next day for the delivery of provisions. Again, they're waiting for that food before they marched on. I had the full opportunity, so again, he's kind of like under house arrest, if you will. He's able to explore a little bit, see the whole camp. And he explores the east and the south side, so the closest to the King of Prussia Mall, if you could visualize where the park is today. And he explores the entrenchments, these earthworks that Washington's army built the year before to protect them from a possible British attack. So we're talking about entrenchments, redoubts, earthworks, if you will. And he writes they're 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, and the mound is only 4 feet high, very narrow. And this is my favorite part. Rich says, could have easily have been beaten down with cannon. So, all that hard work that George Washington's army building those fortifications, we could have beat that. And then he talks about a little bit in here that they're obviously the huts around logs, filled them with clay, which they did, loose straw. I like this part too, where he says, very uncomfortable, as the shelter was not secure from the weather, and the men suffered extremely from including of the seasons. Well, they did suffer, but the soldiers were they were comfortable. And that's a whole other diatribe, but some of the Continental soldiers wrote they were tolerably comfortable. And my predecessors, about 15, maybe 20 years ago, they're like, what does tolerably comfortable mean? And they did a temperature study with some replica huts, you see in that image right there, and they put the fire going in there, you get 12 people in there, it's 20 or 30 degrees warmer in the hut than outside. So you're pretty toasty in there with all that body heat. You're sleeping on mud, and there's mud and gook outside, so that's not great, but you're going to be pretty cozy inside. So, again, it's an officer. He's got higher standards. Alright, so, as they continue on, they're going to march down through Valley Forge, like I said, and they're going to hang out at this place for quite a while before they go down to Charlottesville. It's called Camp Security. It's located east of York. You could visit this site today. It does not look like anything like this. It's farmland, surrounded by suburbia, and there's a really good website that they have, and they have done numerous archaeological digging to find remnants of a stockade, of log huts, of accoutrements, the stuff that you might have, oops, I lost my button, I lost a coin, I lost a spoon, I broke something, throw it out, who cares? Based on Sergeant Lamb, who was an officer, and he drew these, and he wrote about it. So he says, Lord Cornwallis's army could find, which is another army that will go there, but using all of that documentation, we're able to get a better sense of what Camp Security looked like during the time period. And so, it was built in 1781. It was used to detain some of those soldiers from General Burgoyne's army and then also from Lord Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. And it was on a 200-acre farm, for example. What that stockade is, you can see right there. Following the end of the war in the spring of 1783, so a couple years into soldiers being cramped in there, building all those huts, and again, you have women, again, right there for you. Those camp followers, the wives of those officers, those soldiers. It was abandoned. Some of the former prisoners were given land in Canada for their exchange of service. So the British government didn't forget about them. They're still heroes, so they're going to get that land that they deserve in exchange for their service. Others will stay in the United States, but most of them will return to England. There's about a 30% death rate of diseases at Camp Security, to give you an example. And when they left, it was about 1,200 British soldiers and about 1,400 Germans out of that 6,000. So we're looking at about 2,600 out of that 6,000 that left. And again, a couple hundred are going to die of diseases, but a lot of them are going to disappear or actually join the American Army as a way to get out. And again, this is their final destination, if you will, the Convention Army in Charlottesville. And again, they're building those log huts, very similar to Valley Forge or some other places. And again, they're clear-cutting the land to build hundreds of them for all these people. And again, the women and the children are there. And this is a sketch of one of those huts that they built. And this is in the collection of our sister park, Morristown National Historical Park, from German officer who drew that. Very beautiful and elegant hut there with the split logs and then the shingling there for you. There's going to be some other barracks in between that some of the Convention Army might stay in. Lancaster Barracks. So in the city of Lancaster, they will build a stockade in a building in 1777 under William A. Attlee. He's representing the state of Pennsylvania as kind of in charge of the prisoners of war. He's got to figure out, okay, how do I get them food? How do I make sure they get the pay from the British government? How many guys do I have to guard all these people? So he's got to try to figure that out throughout. This is the Cape Cold House. This was in Carlisle. I don't think it's there anymore. And John Andre went there first before he went to Lancaster. And again, I apologize for anyone who has visited or has been to Carlisle. It's a beautiful city. He hated it. Every day they were pelted or reviled in the streets. Again, as officers, they're exploring. They're seeing, oh, there's a tavern over here. There's a stream over here. We can go get some water. Oh, no. They're getting harassed and attacked. The smell of a hatchet is, let's see, what else? Several of us have been fired at. So that's not good. They tried escaping warrant and take different roads. So they're only allowed to travel 6 miles out. And he says, such is a brotherly love that our capitulation promised us. So they're like, oh, don't worry about it. You're going to be fine there. Well, not really. So it's going to be mixed on where they are. I'm not going to read all this to you here. So this is a letter that was written by another local you might be familiar with. His name is Mark Berg. If you're familiar with Hopewell Furnace, out that way, west of here, south of Reading, our sister park sharing administration services, he's in charge of Hopewell Furnace at the time. And so he's the chairman of the Committee of Correspondence, like a local representative body. Think of like a city council for Reading in that area. And so he's writing to the Pennsylvania delegates, the state government. Gentlemen, a number of English soldiers who have lately been taken in Canada, like John Andre and some of those other guys, have arrived here with their wives and children. And then it says, we were much surprised at such a large party being ordered here without any previous notice. Well, that's nice. Surprise! Welcome! You have all these refugees, you have all these prisoners of war. Please take care of them. See you later. And so, it says, it was a pleasure that Congress said that soldiers should be quartered here immediately. And then he's talking about Mr. Haller, a member of the committee, to provide housing, firewood, and provisions for this party. Because if they don't, they're going to suffer in this severe seasons of bad weather. We're unacquainted with the Honorable Congress, the quantities of provisions that have been allowed by these prisoners. And we just express to you that send us directions. So he's letting them know, he's letting Congress know, he's letting the state government know, it's like, these people just showed up on our doorstep. What are we supposed to do with them? We're not going to kill them. They're suffering, so this gentleman here is providing houses, firewood, and provisions. So give us some money, because we spent some money to take care of these people. How long are they staying here? Where are they going? So that's going to be a problem for some of these local communities. Sometimes George Washington's going to let these people know. Members of Congress are going to let these people know. Other times, there's going to be a couple guards and go, all right, we're here for the night. Excuse me, what? So they're going to have to deal with all of that baggage, if you will. Another local place you might be familiar with, Reading, Pennsylvania. So this is Reading. Back then, a little smaller than it is today. This is Mount Penn for you. And one of the places that Germans stayed is right here, on the base of Mount Penn. and they stayed for a couple nights. And there's a little community there called Camp Hesha. And it's a historic Pennsylvania state marker with a blue sign, and you can see it today. And I visited, and I was like, Camp Hesha, what is that? And I did some research, and it was the site of a stockade for German prisoners of war, on their way to Lancaster, on their way down to York, or all the way down to Charlottesville or Winchester or Dumfries in Virginia or Maryland. So again, your local connection right there. And that's just one of many examples. Again, like I said, there's going to be guys staying in Bethlehem for a couple days, Allentown as well, Easton, Pennsylvania. So they're all over the place, all these folks. Switch gears a little bit, go a little bit further to a different scenario. So you have towns, or they're outside in the farmland. This is completely different. This is on my list to eventually visit. It's a very interesting site. You could visit it today. It's Newgate Prison in East Granbury, Connecticut. And this place was going to house captured known loyalists and some British soldiers or German soldiers. So remember, this is a civil war as much of it is as a revolutionary war. Neighbors fighting neighbors, brothers fighting brothers, uncles fighting uncles, etc., etc. And so during this time, it was an actual mine. So they were mining. They're going to put these prisoners in the mine. And the mine will be known as Hell. And some of these prisoners are going to be employed as miners to do that work, to continue expanding or extracting resources from there. They will create, again, a stockade. It's 2 acres, 12-foot tall prisoner perimeter walls. It held over 800 people over the Revolutionary War. And you can see some lovely scenes of people getting whipped or leading those prisoners down the mine shaft, which is in that building right there. There were some breakouts. Some people were able to escape. For example, here. Happened on May 18, 1781. The prisoners rushed the guards as a door was opened up to allow family visitors. Pushed that family out of the way and said, "Get out of my way." And they ran into the middle of the night into the local surrounding area. About 20 people escaped from the Newgate Prison. So, some of these folks are going to be more fortunate compared to American prisoners of war. There was some bad experiences, like, John Andre feared for his life. Some of these people working and doing physical labor, but others, not so much. Like those Germans actually working out in the farm fields. A lot of these Germans, before I get to the next section, I should add this point, is that a lot of the Germans who were in Reading, who were in York, they were allowed to work in these local communities, but as long as they came back before sunset, or they were okay. And they interacted with the local communities because there's a lot of Germans out there. And so they're talking to these people. They're like, "You own land? You have the right to vote? You don't have a lord? This is great." Because a lot of these German soldiers are serving their lord in these little different German kingdoms during the course of the American Revolution. And so when they go back, they're going to have nothing. Yeah, they might have a little paycheck from fighting in the war. That's it. So that's going to be a big driver for some of these people to stay. So think about that as well. So I talked a little bit about the British, talked a little bit about the Germans' perspective. Now what about the Americans? Well, that's going to happen to them. So various studies are going to place about 18 to 30,000 American soldiers and sailors captured by the British Army. Approximately 3,000 sailors are going to be sent here. This is the Old Mill Prison in Plymouth, England. That's in southern England. And why they're sent there is because, and I find this such a fascinating name for a law. It's called the Pirate Act of March of 1777. Well, because the British government felt that those American sailors were pirates. Think of Blackbeard and all those folks. So it's going to deny due process and prisoner exchange. So they're not going to be exchanged for that 1-to-1 or 3-to-5 or whatever. No, no, no. These guys are lower than low. These are criminals. These are not sailors. These aren't professional Navy soldiers. Nope. So it's going to deny due process and prisoner exchange for committing piracy upon his ships and goods of His Majesty's subjects, as the law says. And again, they were in Fortin and in an old mill prison. And the only way for a lot of these guys to get out was escape, which some of them will do. A lot of them are going to die. Or consenting to join the Royal Navy as a way to get out. Because the British Navy is also desperate for sailors as the war will drag on. When other European powers will be involved and the British is going to be stretched, they're desperate. They're going to start going into these jails and saying, anybody want to get out? Join the Navy and get out. And a lot of them will do that because of the horrible conditions of places like this. Ethan Allen showed his picture before, and some of his men that were captured in Canada in 1775 are going to be sent to Pendyce Castle, which isn't too far in southern England, and they're going to be locked together in a common apartment. And there's going to be about a 5% mortality rate. And the British government does not like Ethan Allen, and they confine him into a little cage, they beat him up. They will eventually exchange him for a British officer. He is a broken man when he comes back a couple years later, right around the time of the Valley Forge encampment. And the Americans will use that as a way to say, see, the British government is not doing their end of the bargain. They are treating these people like cattle. It's disgusting. Another gentleman who's going to be captured, who I showed in the very beginning there, is General Charles Lee. Remember, he's second in command of the Continental Army, so you got George Washington, and it's Charles Lee. He's captured December 13th of 1776, so the year before Valley Forge, in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, not too far from originally from, and he's held in the City Hall of New York City, near where the modern City Hall is. The British are going to use buildings, including barns, jails, schools, old sugar houses, warehouses, anything available to them in North America to cram as many people in as humanly possible. Again, they're going to be filling all of lower Manhattan, because that's all Manhattan is, it's really, with all of these folks. Because during the Battle of New York in 1776, there's a great fire in September that burns about 20% of the city in this kind of area here, along the North River there, Hudson River. And so they're going to lose a lot of buildings, a lot of real estate, a lot of important places they could have put all these people in, but they can't do that anymore. So the British are like, what are we going to do? Can't put these people in buildings anymore because there's barely enough for our soldiers, because they got thousands of British soldiers in New York City as their main base that they need. So they're like, you know what? We have an idea. It's going to be some other ships. We have a lot of ships that we'll put them in. Again, some of those bases, Old City Hall, the Provost, the old sugar house, full of soldiers. These buildings aren't here anymore. They were torn down in the early 1800s. Modern day skyscrapers are on the sites today. This just looks scary. But full of soldiers. Before I get into the boat part, I do want to mention, I found this recently. John Fell, he is a soldier who was sent to the Provost. Okay, it's near City Hall. And he has a diary. I only took some of it here, but to show you some of the conditions that these American soldiers experienced. Not allowed to fetch good water. And get water to drink or wash. The prisoners are very sick. The women refuse to speak to their sick husbands. And they're treated cruelly by the sentries, the guards. Justin Moore dies and he's carried out. There's a horrible scene of whipping, some beatings in there by the British. These are prisoners of war. They didn't do anything anymore, and they're getting beat in there. And then, big diseases, smallpox. Kills another soldier. That's part. He will survive, but he will be in there for a year, and it does change him severely. So, where are the British going to do it? So New York City, remember, all the way over there. 20% of the city is burnt down. Put them over here. Just a little moat area here, a little bay. Beautiful area. Wallet Bay it's called. And they're going to stow them on prison ships. Because they can put them in here, away from the East River, away from the channel. And these are going to be old vessels. And I'll show you some images of some of the most famous. So think of a ship of line with the sails on it, stripped of all of that. No rigging on it, no cannons, no stuff inside. So think of a ship pretty much empty inside. That's what we're talking about. And then you fill it with people. You just keep putting more people in, more people in, more people in it. And you have a couple guards at the top, you close the door, see you later. That's what we're talking about. And so some of these prison ships are going to be the Jersey, the Fairmont, the Hope, the Scorpion, the Hunter. And I should have, oh, there they are right there. And so this gives you a little sense of some of those prisoner of war ships, different years they were issued and sent into Wallet Bay, which is the site of the Brooklyn Navy Yard today, by the way. And you can see 200, 500, 1,000, 1,200. Some of the records we don't know, unknown. Some hospital ships compared to just some regular ships full of people. There's going to be a little bit of that distinction, but hospital ships, it's not going to be a good experience either. Thousands of these people are going to die of diseases and starvation during the American Revolution because of the lack of medical care, the food, the neglect, the abuse, as you saw. Some of them, again, are also forced to join the Royal Navy as a way to get out, to save their lives. The lucky ones, again, those officers, might be exchanged for 1-to-1, or paroled. John Van Dyke, he's a sailor, sent to some of these prison ships. He writes, he's on the HMS Jersey in May of 1778. When I came aboard, her stench was so great I thought it would kill me. Soldiers remember the morning cry of the British Guards. Rebels, bring out your dead. How many are dead now? We don't know the total of how many were held at one time. Again, these are ranges, and this is only a small sample of 1 or 2 ships. There's dozens. Again, many felt sadness, isolation from their friends, from their family. Soldier wrote, I felt like a lone bird in a cage. Again, that prison ship, full of people, some guards, windows if they're lucky, but they might all be boarded up, ports on that. Another example from Trunchbull. There's a little bit of speculation that some historians are saying this might not be about the Jersey. This might be a mental institution in America after the American Revolution. We're still not sure, but initial documentation says it's about the Jersey, but that could change. History is always evolving. We learn more and more, but again, showing the anguish, regardless, the sadness, the darkness, the cramped quarters, people dying. In addition to that, some historians have done a lot of good research on trying to figure out, yeah, we know that they're not getting enough food or their clothing or anything like that, but how much food are they supposed to get? So there's your beef, your bread, your pork, your peas, your oatmeal, that's how much they're supposed to get, and they kind of calculate it out. It's only 1,500 calories a day. According to nutritionists, you're supposed to get anywhere between 2,000 and 2,300 a day. So these people are going to lose about a pound a week. And they're going to, unfortunately, look like that. So, what is the legacy and the memory of these prisoners of war from all of that? So what happens is, as the war drags on, you remember you had the surrender of 6,000 soldiers at Saratoga. You had the surrender of 6,000 soldiers at Yorktown. 1781. A lot of Americans think, oh, war's over. No, it's not. The British government still hasn't negotiated the peace. They are not recognizing the United States. Again, they don't want to. But they realize at that moment, as the war continues in other places around the world, Caribbean, Gibraltar, English Channel. They need to wash their hands of this. So they're slowly coming to the realization, all right, we need to send all these people back because the war's over. So in 1782, March 25th, Parliament repeals the Pirate Act for American prisoners of war. So they realize this is done, and they start shipping those folks back to the United States. One prisoner wrote, "It is impossible to conceive, much less describe, the horror that he witnessed on some of those prison ships. Anywhere between 11,000 and 18,000 American soldiers and sailors will die in British captivity during the American Revolution. In Brooklyn, on Wild Bay, the area remained littered with the bones of the men who died on those prison ships for years. Because what happens with those prisoner of war ships, when the soldiers are dead, or they discover that they died, they don't leave them on the boat. They take them off with some of those other soldiers who were being mistreated. They're rowing these little small boats with the British Guard, and they're going back real quick here for you folks. They're going to the salt in the marsh area, and they're burying them out there away from the ships. So, but unfortunately, once the war is over and the ships are gone, low tide, you're finding more stuff, it's coming up. So bones are going to be found for years from all of those folks, unfortunately. So, what Americans start to do after that generation has passed, so we're talking about the 1830s now. A lot of those guys are 80s, 90s who are passed away. Joseph Plum Martin, he's in his 70s, I think, at this time period. They start deciding we need to pay respect to this generation who started the Republic. And so the first monument for prisoners of war for the Americans is going to be near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which will be an active base for quite a long time in American history. And it's from a gentleman named Benjamin Romanes. It's called the Antechamber, the Tomb of the Martyrs, built between 1839 and 1840. You can see it right there with a nice gate on it. And it's going to be a crypt. They're gathering the bones of all these people that were washed ashore. They can't figure out who is who, so they're respectively putting them together in one location so they are not disturbed. That is active until the 1870s, until people forget about it and it falls apart. In the 1850s, while that's going on, in New York City itself, remember, New York City, prisoner of war, Trinity Church, some of these other places that you might be familiar with, Trinity Church was a prisoner of war site. They took out the pews and people were just jammed in there. So on that grounds, you can still see this monument today. This still exists, this middle one here. The inscription reads, "Erected to the memory of those brave and good men who have died while imprisoned in this city for their devotion to the cause of American independence." So again, paying that respect to all those folks that fell before. Then it takes another generation to say, we need to do a better job. We need to remember what happened here. This you can still visit today. It's the Prison Ships Martyrs Monument. It was created in 1908. It's in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, New York, near the site of Fort Greene, which was a fortification during the Battle of New York. So very fitting, also near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, by the way. And they took thousands of bones, and they're in a crypt underneath this. The dedication ceremony was November 14th, 1908. It included a parade with about 15,000 participants, including the military, the National Guard, veterans, civic leaders, even President-elect Taft. And then you have the kind of almost an eternal flame, if you will, as well at the top there for you. In addition to that, let's take a little step back. So that's remembering our fallen. What about the other side? So, as the war dragged on, in 1782, the British government decides we're not paying and we're not going to provide clothes to our fallen soldiers. because the communication between Washington and the British just falls apart. And the Americans come up with a arbitrary number, if you will, to eventually say, if you want to go back to New York City and get on a boat and go back to Germany, it's going to cost you $80. And that's a lot of money back then. And so they call it redemptions. And what they do is, if they can't pay it, you can work 3 years out in Lancaster, out in York, as a tenant farmer, as a merchant, as a tradesman, using your hands, and that debt will be written off, and will give you a free ride back to Germany or wherever you need to go. So a little indentured servitude after the American Revolution for some of these folks. It's not going to happen to all these German soldiers, but it's going to happen to some. Anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Germans decide, you know what, I'm not going back to Germany, because I don't have anything there. I don't have any friends, I don't have any family there. They're all gone. If I go back, I'm going to work for a lord, and that's not what I want. I can stay here. And so thousands of them will stay here. And there's a whole book about this that I discovered about 1.5 years ago, and I find it fascinating. It's one of the earliest depictions of veterans from the American Revolution. So Lewis Miller, he was a young man. I think he was born right around the time of the American Revolution, so he's in his 20s. And he's a tradesman, and he likes to draw a lot of York. Local stuff going on, what's going on in the city, what do the buildings look like, and it's a great resource. And he went around and started talking to some of these German old guys. And he found out that a lot of these guys were with the British Army. And he writes a little bit about them, and Heinrich here, he was captured at Trenton, New Jersey in 1776, and then he had to lay down his musket. He was allowed to work for the local inhabitants in Conestoga, Lancaster, and Hallam Township in York, and then he lived there for the rest of his life. And so there's about 30 of these guys in this sketchbook that he drew, and they're all fascinating because he customizes what they have, their clothes, how they dress, a little bit how they look. They look a little bit all similar, but he's giving that little personality, that respect of what they accomplished afterwards, not as a soldier, but as a civilian. In 1785, the United States and Prussia, which will eventually become Germany much later, have an agreement called the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And in that agreement, it's one of the first international agreements of how to treat prisoners of war from this legacy. And eventually that treaty will influence other treaties that you might be familiar with, like the Hague Convention in 1899, or the Geneva Convention in 1929, and then updated in 1949 after another great conflict, of saying this is how we're supposed to treat prisoners of war, with dignity, with respect, as a human being. Does that happen all the time? No, but that's the idea. So starting right after the American Revolution. So, going over a little here for you folks, and I apologize. So, the story of the prisoners of war, as you saw, was a little bit of a tale of two contrasts. The Americans' overall treatment of the British and the Hessians with respect, and sometimes allowing them to explore and work and be part of that community, that led to many of them to stay with their families and say, you know what, I want to be part of this new adventure, this new country that they're creating here, and part of that American story. For the Americans, as you've experienced, it's the complete opposite. They're treated with very little respect or care for, malice, neglect, you name it, all of the above. And because of that lack of respect and care, collectively, we felt ashamed of their experience. We didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it, really. They didn't want to live that trauma. And so we forgot about it, and it fell through the wayside. However, over time, just like as I kind of alluded to with some of those international agreements of taking care of the protections of these prisoners of war, did the American Republic, as you saw, started to realize and give respect to all of these folks who gave their last full measure of devotion to the cause of liberty. So, almost done. I just want to share some of my resources. So some of these are first-hand accounts. Some of these are a lot of great secondary accounts that I found from our local library and some other places along the way, where you can dive in a little bit more at some different aspects of the American Revolution, the prisoner of war, again, camp security. They have a great website where they share all their archaeological findings over the years of giving a better picture of what that place looked like in their experience. And then finally, I just want to toot our horn a little bit. We have a big event coming up. It's less than 24 hours away. I know I'll be there. And it's the commemoration of the actual Army marching into Valley Forge. And my coworkers have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into putting this together. So I hope if you have an opportunity, please come out 6 to 8. Start at the Visitor Center. You will walk up, candlelight, to the Muhlenberg Brigade huts, and in between you'll see different reenactors depicting different parts of the encampment, talking about the soldiers, talking about the African Americans, talking about the women and children, and how all of that was important to the Valley Forge story. So I hope you come out for our commemoration of that program between 6 and 8 on Tuesday the 19th, because my coworkers, they've done a lot of good work, and I think it's going to be great. But anyway, questions for all of you?
Take questions in the room first,
Yes,
and then we'll
ma'am.
go to Zoom.
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
But the prisoner ships,
Mm-hmm.
they were people prisoners in there when they burned, and how did they burn? Was it accidental, or were they bombed, or kind of, how were they destroyed?
Sure. So the prisoner of war ships, remember, they're decommissioned warships. So the British soldiers and sailors, they're taking out all the cannons, they're taking out all the weapons, they're taking out any loose nails, or there's this window over here, they're going to start, blocking it, because they need that space to be controlled for those prisoners of war. So they're going to do all that first. Then those prisoners of war are going to be in there, and they're going to be in various states. Some are going to be wounded, some are going to be very ill, some are going to be perfectly healthy. And they're going to jam them in there into confined spaces, rooms in that ship with guards. They'll probably have chains on them where they can't move around too much, and they'll occasionally go in there, inspect the soldiers, see if anyone has lice or scabies or really nasty diseases. If anybody's misbehaving, they might take them out and beat them up separately, and then they'll give them food. But when they're sick, they're taking them out of there, putting them on that little rowboat, taking a couple of their buddies and saying, okay, you're doing that rowing, you're doing that physical labor, land on the beach, take that friend, here's a shovel, and there's a guard with a gun, and they start digging, and they put that body in there, and then they gotta row back. Alright, thanks. And a lot of the soldiers will write, that's really the only time they'll get fresh air, because of them going out there, burying their friend, and then traveling back on the boat. So I hope that answered that part question.
No? Because my question was concerning, there were like 6 ships that burned, prisoner of war ships, and I was wondering if
I see. Yes, I see.
If the
Yes.
prisoners were on the ship when they burned, and
No,
they all died.
no. So
or
with
if
that,
they were, who were they?
no,
How
I'm sorry, I
they
apologize.
burned.
No, I see what you're saying there.
How
I thought you
they
said
burned.
buried. So no, with the burn that it says there on there, yes. So they had a fire. So there was a fire in there that damaged the ship, or it burned late in 1777. I don't know more about that, unfortunately. I'm taking this directly from historian, and unfortunately that historian has passed away a couple of years ago, so I can't ask him. And so, with that being said, though, so that burned in 1777. It was commissioned in 1777, the Kitty. It had 250 sailors. I don't know of any records of American soldiers being stuck on there when that fire happens, for example, with some of them. But like the Good Hope, it was active for a year and then it burned. So most likely in those situations, they're going to shuffle people around. They're going to shuffle some of these prisoners to the hospital ships where they could die, or they're going to ship them over to the HMS Jersey, because that's going to be the biggest one. These ships are going to vary in size, so they might say, you know what, this isn't enough, this isn't good enough, these ships, because they got damaged or they burnt down. We're going to ship them over to another building, or another ship. So that's what I think they're gonna do for you. So I hope that clarified that for you, and I apologize. Did you have a second part to that question, ma'am? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, one of the possibilities is the ships that would deteriorate sitting there at anchor.
Mm-hmm.
And so they may have gotten so bad and be leaking so bad, they moved the prisoners to another ship and
Right.
burned it.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. Or they could have tried it, or the conditions could have been so disgusting, so
Right.
nasty, with smallpox, with typhus, with whatever you want to imagine, which you probably don't. They're like, this is even unsafe for the British Guards to be in. And we can't lose the British Guard. We could, we don't care about any of these people. And so they might say, all right, get everybody off, put them on another ship, burn that ship because it's disgusting. You have to quarantine it, you have to burn it, you have to get rid of it. So that could be a possibility as well. Yes, sir.
The fact that the British didn't recognize America
Mm-hmm.
and George Washington as commander-in-chief, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
did that impact the way that they treated the prisoners? And were they actually prisoners of war from the British perspective?
Yes and no. So, as I talked about the sailors, the British government did not consider the American Navy, which wasn't really a navy, or the privateers, as the privateers, they're pirates. They're sanctioned doing piracy and stealing and burning other British ships. So they don't consider them prisoners of war. Absolutely not. So that's why they're going to send them to England, put them in jails there, treat them as common criminals, the lowest of the low. And it backfires a little bit with the British government because there's a lot of locals who are like, there's a war going on. These aren't local people that are like stealing or doing bad things. These are from somewhere else. And they start, there's these little organizations, and Ben Franklin instigates it a little bit, of having some local aid groups trying to go to these prisons in southern England and saying, convincing the guard, bribing the guard and going, here's some extra food, here's some medicine. And so they're taking care of those people. For the American soldiers though, you're absolutely right. The British government really didn't want to consider Washington and those soldiers as a de facto recognition of the United States because again, if they do that, France, Spain, those other European powers are going to be in there and they're going to have to do more and they really don't want to do that. So it's going to be a balance between, yes, we don't care about these people, they're our enemy, we want to destroy them, but we want to not kill them because that will look really bad with PR and all of that, and we want to have the loyalists stay on our side and try to have all these people join us. Because if the British get too aggressive and really go after and really kill or massacre these people, you're going to lose everybody else. And so they got to work that balance. And then going back to my very point in the beginning, from that quote from that British commanding officer, relieve us of this burden. So even though they're treating them like dirt, they kind of still want to negotiate with Washington because they don't want to take care of these guys. They want their own soldiers back. So it's going to be very complicated, very nuanced, and they're going to be very hypocritical and wishy-washy. So I hope that answered. So it's all of the above. All of the above with that.
We need to go to Zoom because the library's closing
Oh,
at 8 o'clock.
okay.
Anyone on Zoom with a question? Anybody on Zoom with a question? Feel free to unmute. No one? Okay. Russell, thank you so much for
All
this.
right. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight and those on Zoom for zooming in. Take care. Good night now.